Um, Welcome everybody to this event of SME for Labour. We're going to be looking at the latest opinion polls and what they mean for Labour and elections in May. My name's Siobhain McDonagh and I'm the MP for Mitcham and Morden in South London, and I'm delighted to be here chairing this session with so many great speakers. We're going to begin with Gideon Skinner. He's the Research Director and Head of Political Research at Ipsos MORI, where he's worked since 1997. Brilliant date, I'm sure everybody would agree. Gideon leads on our research into cross-cutting issues that face all public services, such as public service reform, and research into many political and social trends, including trust. As everybody will know, on May 6th, we have elections right across the country, from Scotland to Wales to local elections to mayors. So how is it going to be? What are the opinions saying, Gideon?
Okay, so thank you very much for the introduction and for the invite. I'm just going to speak briefly to give an overview of public opinion and the state of the parties, and maybe some initial thoughts about the elections that are coming up. But then I'm sure Deborah and Carl will then go into things into much more detail than I will, and fill in some of the gaps that I'll be leaving, as will Chris too. So just to give a brief picture of where we are, clearly the last couple of months have probably been dominated by stories of the vaccine bounce, where we see very positive scores for the government. 9 in 10 in our latest poll think the government's doing a good job at getting people vaccinated as quickly as possible. And we see that sort of very high scores amongst Labour supporters as well. So there's pretty good ratings for the government across the piece. And unsurprisingly, when we look at kind of satisfaction with the government over the last year, we see it tracking very closely ratings of how well it is handling the pandemic, with the original kind of halo effect back at the beginning, sort of last spring, a year ago, this month, terrifying as that might be, followed by a dip in the kind of the autumn, September, October period, but picking up again in the last couple of months. And we see that reflected in other things as well. So for example, economic optimism. We saw the biggest single positive swing that we've ever seen since we started collecting optimism indicators since 1978. Still not quite as big as the fall a year ago, but still nevertheless people feeling much more positive. And we see that reflected in, for example, satisfaction ratings for the government, which are the highest we've seen for a government at this stage since Blair in the post-97 era, and Boris Johnson's ratings as well are sort of actually kind of not bad. They're better than Margaret Thatcher's were at this point. They're broadly in line with David Cameron's at this point. So the kind of the government and the ratings for the Conservative Party are not doing badly at all, and seem very closely aligned to general positive opinion about vaccines at the moment. That doesn't necessarily mean it's a terrible position for Labour. We still have a sort of small positive swing towards Labour compared with the 2019 general election results. And for Keir Starmer specifically, there's lots of talk about him. It's clearly his sort of very high ratings that he was getting at the beginning of his leadership haven't been sustained and have been falling. But nevertheless, it's not as if it's sort of historically bad ratings for a new opposition leader, and we know how difficult it is for opposition leaders to make a positive impression amongst the public, and that's kind of really where he is now. Is actually pretty similar to where both David Cameron and Ed Miliband were at an equivalent stage when they were leading the opposition. So there's clearly two different endings maybe that we could see for Keir Starmer, and we don't yet know which way it's going to go. And so that kind of broadly brings us on to clearly a big test for that, and something that's going to set the narrative for that is going to be Labour's performance over the elections coming up in May. Thinking particularly about the locals, that's going to be even more difficult than usual, and we have to put in the standard pollsters caveat at this point. You know, kind of it's very difficult, and you've got to be careful about drawing conclusions and crossovers between local and general elections, and maybe this time more than ever with the impact of COVID, the potential impact on turnout, which is traditionally lower in any case in local elections, and of course the fact that we're now combining 2 rounds elections, the 2016 ones which were delayed and the 2017 elections, which actually both of those are quite different situations as well, which means I was trying to understand, and I think for Labour it's going to be very difficult to set what the expectations should be. 2016, kind of broadly, if you look at the national equivalent vote share, it's pretty neck between Labour and the Conservative seats, mainly due to the number of metropolitan elections that there were. Maybe quite difficult for Labour to make sort of significant advances in those. 2017, on the other hand, was a bit of a high watermark for the Conservatives. You'd expect Labour to make some gains, but exactly where, I think, is clearly going to be the big question, and that's what the speakers coming after me will go into in more detail. You know, Labour, sort of the obvious narrative, looking for positive signs in the north and in the Midlands. Equally, questions for the Conservatives in the south. Are they going to be challenged by Labour or by changing demographics in some of sort of the southern and eastern seats that they hold at the moment? And then just finally, just a reminder that we shouldn't be forgetting about the other parties in all of this, and again, the implications this can have both for the Conservatives when they're up against maybe the Liberal Democrats, but for Labour as well. 2019 was the Lib Dems were the big winners. That was the big story. You know, we don't expect that to be the case. Lib Dems are kind of like look like they're slipping back. So what's that implication going to be? In Scotland, maybe the story is probably going to be focusing more on the SNP and whether they can get a majority than focusing on Labour specifically. And then kind of maybe the other big one is London, where there's going to be really high expectations for Labour to do well. Clearly everyone's expecting Sadiq Khan to win, but you know, there is one where their expectations are very high, and is Labour going to be able to deliver? That will be another sort of part of the mix when people judge how well Labour's done. And so I think that's 5 minutes for me, and I'll let others take over.
Thank you very much, Gideon. Really interesting. Now I think we've been joined by Chris Curtis.
Yeah, I'm here. Sorry for the couple of minute delay. Hello.
Oh, no, don't worry. Great that you're here. And Chris is a senior research manager at Opinium, having recently joined the company from YouGov, and has worked on a general election and referendum polling in the UK for the last 6 years. So over to you, Chris.
Thank you. That's really good. And it was great to see Gideon's introduction there, or comments there, which were basically involved me taking the notes that I had and deleting some of the points that I had that he's already managed to cross off. But no, I'll try and build on what he said. And obviously our polling, and I think a lot of the polls at the moment pretty much agree that what we saw at the start of the year was a situation where both of the main parties were about neck and neck. And what we're seeing now, partly because Keir Starmer's honeymoon is coming to an end, his incredibly good favourability numbers are no longer incredibly good. And also, obviously, the vaccine bounce for the government. Just another example. What was that?
Sorry, nothing from me, Chris.
Oh, sorry. No, sorry. I thought I had a comment. All I was going to say, as a thing from that, we were previously seeing, when you asked people if they approved of the way the government was handling coronavirus, you'd regularly get 20% more people saying they disapproved than approved. Our most recent poll had the same number saying they approve as disapprove. So that's quite a significant shift in attitudes there. So I think generally, all of the pollsters' caveats, which I'd like to make if I had time, to be applied. But the general expectation, I think, at this stage is that we're going to go into these May elections with a Conservative lead, let's say, of 6 to 7 points, maybe a little bit more, maybe a little bit less. There's some evidence that the gap is slightly smaller if you ask people to think about how they'll vote in local elections than if you ask people to think about how they'll vote in general elections. There's some evidence that the gap might be a bit smaller in that case, but I wouldn't read too much into it. It's not conclusive, and a lot of this elections are going to come come down to turnout, and we don't really know what impact the pandemic is going to have on turnout patterns, not least of which you'll have half the country vaccinated and half the country not vaccinated, and there'll be an age skew on the half that is vaccinated, and that could also have an effect. So lots and lots of unknowns there, but that's the general pattern we're looking at. So in terms of what that means, I will not so much cover the red wall, because I know Deborah's here and she's much more of an expert on it than me, and what impact could happen in those council seats. So I'll focus a bit more on Wales, and then Scotland, and then London as well. The one that I will talk about on the that touches on the red wall point that I think is interesting to look out is the mayoralties. And one thing that I'm particularly interested in looking at, we're saying that broadly speaking, we're in the same sort of position in 2017, which would mean a very, very close race in an area like the West Midlands, for example, which was pretty much neck and neck for the West Midlands mayoral race last time round. However, I think the general expectation is that the Conservatives of Andy Street in the West Midlands is going to hold on to that probably quite comfortably, and that's going to be off the back of incumbency. So we're also seeing in the polling these really quite dramatic incumbency effects where incumbent mayoral candidates seem to be getting a bit of a boost. So that's going to make things a bit more difficult for Labour in places like Tees Valley, places like the West Midlands, but it's probably going to make life a little bit easier for Labour in, say, the Southwest mayoralty, where the Conservatives are not running an incumbent candidate. The other thing that I think is interesting, from given that we're now back in this situation of a 6 to 7 point lead for the Conservatives nationally, is what that means for Wales, because Labour's in an incredibly difficult situation in Wales, where basically, if they don't get a majority and the Lib Dems don't gain a seat, which now looks to be the case, they're going to end up in coalition with Plaid Cymru, which now seems like an increasingly likely option. In the sort of a couple of months ago when Labour was doing well, it looked possible that they might be able to gain enough seats, gain the list seat, gain the Rhondda, gain in potentially in Preseli, Pembrokeshire. But now that's looking increasingly unlikely. So it seems increasingly likely by the day that Labour is going to end up in a situation where they possibly go backwards slightly in Wales and then end up having to go into coalition with Plaid Cymru. So again, not necessarily great news in Wales off the back of this recent polling slump. As we look at it at the moment, is Labour, with its new leader, potentially starting to climb slightly in the polls. And I think it's now looking possible, if not likely, that Labour could climb into second place. Anas's numbers in the initial polling we've seen are all right. They're certainly better than Douglas Ross's. It's whether they can turn that sort of positive, back a few years ago, there was obviously a negative view of the Labour Party. That's been neutralised. Most people have a fairly meh view of the Labour Party in Scotland. There's enough people who fairly like them. It's whether the Labour Party can turn that sort of view into votes, and that's Anas's challenge for the next 6 weeks. If they do, it's possible that he can drag back enough of those soft SNP voters, not only to defy the SNP of a majority, but also to come in second place. That's definitely a possibility up in Scotland. I think that really hangs in the balance there, and it's one of the most interesting races to watch. And then just to finish off with London, because our most recent London poll was out on Monday this week, and it showed an incredible performance for Sadiq Khan. I don't want to do any more to raise expectations off the back of what Gideon said, but our poll did show Sadiq Khan not just winning the race, but winning the race in the first round. So 53% of he won 53% of the vote, I think, to 28% of Sean Bailey's vote. That is his best polling he's had since December 2018. He's also overperforming the Labour Party slightly in London, while Sean Bailey is noticeably underperforming the Conservative Party. So I don't want to raise his expectations any more than is necessary, but I think we are looking at a very good performance in London for Sadiq Khan. And I'll just add slightly on that point as well. That's, we talk about this move towards Labour picking up votes in the north, losing votes in the south, and that's true. But actually, since the last election, the Tories have increased their vote share slightly in London, and Labour's gone backwards slightly in London. So it's that Sadiq Khan overperformance and the Conservative Party's underperformance in London that's really making the difference there, and really means that Sadiq Khan, I think at this stage, is more likely to win on the first round for the first time in London's history and won the second round. So just to sum up those points, we are now in a situation unlike where we were a couple of months ago, where Labour's probably going to end up in May being behind the Conservatives, probably by about somewhere around 6 to 7 points. That's going to make life very difficult for the party in many areas. It means they're probably not going to pick up those mayoralties that they lost in 2017, or very many of them. It means that in Wales, it's now going to be a challenge, if not impossible, to get a majority there, and they're probably going to end up, or possibly going to end up in a coalition with Plaid as a result. In London, obviously, it doesn't make much difference because they're going to win the mayoralty there anyway. And in Scotland, it's going to be interesting to see what happens there. And I think that's the real place which there's still a lot of uncertainty, partly off the back of the fact that Labour's obviously got a new leader up there who does seem to be polling fairly well. Was that 5 minutes?
That was great. Thank you very much, Chris. Highs and lows in presentation. Our next speaker is Carl Shoben. Carl is Director of Strategic Communications for polling company Survation. He has uniquely worked as a political strategist for both Jeremy Corbyn and Tony Blair. Perhaps he could tell us how both those worked. In between his political and polling roles, Carl has worked at all levels in communications and engagements across the NHS. Welcome, Carl.
Thank you. I think I'm probably the only person in history that has worked closely with Tony Blair and Jeremy Corbyn, possibly. And I mean, you know, sort of slightly joking aside, I hope that because of that, some of the things that I say will be taken in the sort of cross-factional way in which it's intended. You know, I'm just kind of, Chris and Gideon have spoken in a lot of detail about what we can expect and where the polling is at the moment. So I'm not going to repeat that or offer much more than that. And I think I'd just talk about some of the trends that we're picking up in polling and relate that to some sort of broader political strategy, you know, and my take on that. So, I mean, I think obviously these elections, I think, are going to be quite difficult for Labour because of the reasons that Chris and Gideon outlined. I mean, I actually think that if you look beneath some of the sentiments at the moment, it could be slightly more difficult than the polls are currently showing. Because if you look and you listen to people in focus groups, optimism is growing. People are cheerful. The sun is beginning to come out, and people are getting ready for the lockdown to be lifted. And that, combined with the vaccine and the vaccine bounce, I think is lifting Boris Johnson disproportionately higher than actually even the Conservatives. So he is, I mean, you know, someone that's worked on elections against Boris Johnson. One of the things which makes him such a tricky character is his cheerful and optimistic personality. So and that, combined with people feeling that optimism at the moment, I think could be quite a challenge for Labour, and potentially more so than the current polls are showing. So you know, that is a challenge. I also think either Chris or Gideon alluded to low turnout in these elections, and the lower the turnout, the higher the proportion of older voters who have had the vaccine. I think that again is going to be worth some extra points for the Conservatives. So, you know, kind of London aside, I think these are quite challenging elections, and I know Deborah is going to talk in more detail about the red wall, but I mean, just talk a little bit about Labour strategy at the moment, because having been involved in various forms of Labour strategy over a number of years with different people in different formats, there is always this divide in whether Labour doubles down on its growing voter base in the cities, younger people, you know, higher proportions of graduates. That's where the growth in Labour's vote has been over the last 10 years. You know, so does Labour strategy focus on maximising that? Or does it focus primarily on winning back the older voters who are less likely to live in cities? You know, they're more likely to be of traditional working class background. And it's, you know, it's clear that the Keir strategy is edged towards the second. So it's, you know, I mean, I absolutely agree with that. And I've often been accused of having blue Labour tendencies during my time. And you know, I mean, obviously you have to target both voter coalition. You have to have a coalition of both of these. It's absolutely crucial. You know, however, I mean, you know, the older voter that has left Labour is where the red wall, where the cracks started to appear in the red wall and where they finally broke. And if Labour is going to win the next election, you know, or start doing well in these May elections, it needs to make a big impact on those votes. So, you know, I'm with Keir on that focus and that strategy. You know, some of my old colleagues are not, but that's absolutely where I am. And I'm absolutely, you know, think patriotism's important, and, you know, security and all those issues are absolutely key. So, but just the one area where I think that we are in danger of fighting the last war is on the economy and some of the social policy issues. So everyone who has done focus groups in and around Labour with Labour voters for the last 10 years, they've all heard the same things. You know, you could almost name them all. Labour spends too much, Labour will crash the economy, and Gordon sold all the gold. It's the three things that you hear time and time again in focus groups. But in the last couple of years, that has been becoming less salient. You've had to force it out of people more. You've had to tease it out more. And when you get into in-depth conversations, and this is, you know, shown quite clearly in quantitative polling as well, people are more in favour of higher spending, higher taxes on the wealthy, and stuff like that. So I do worry that as Labour tries to target the older lost voters that have often moved to the Tories, they're trying to do it with a narrative that would have worked 10 years ago but might be less salient now. And the challenge that makes that even harder is the Conservatives are really ideologically flexible at the moment. So if Labour moves too far away from some of those issues, there's a big risk that the Conservatives will continue to come across as the change party and offer big solutions. So I think the strategy is right. I just worry slightly that the focus on what I would say are kind of older issues on the economy may make it difficult for Labour to win those red wall voters back. And I think what we're seeing at the moment is that is remaining a real challenge. That's it.
Thank you, Carl. That's you didn't tell us how it was between Tony and Jeremy, who it was easier to advise. Or is that giving the game away?
I think yes. One of the things with Jeremy is you could tell when he was annoyed with his advisors, because he'd wear his green suit into work, and I've noticed he started wearing it again recently.
Well, thank you very much. Fashion advice. Our final speaker this evening is well known to many in tonight's audience, Deborah Mattinson. After Deborah has finished, we will open it up to questions. And if you could put your questions in the chat box, that would be great, because my instructions tell me I can choose the question and ask them. So it's my way to run a meeting. But Deborah, as I said, has been a friend of the Labour Party for a very, very long time and has great polling credibility, and we're delighted that she's here this evening. She's one of the UK's leading commentators on public opinion. Before co-founding, she jointly ran the Chime Research and Engagement Division. She was a pollster to Gordon Brown. I don't know if she can give us any insight on that, firstly as Chancellor of the Exchequer and then as Prime Minister. So, Deborah, over to you.
Great, thanks, Siobhain, and thanks to everybody who's gone before me. I was a bit worried that having 4 pollsters, I don't know what the collective noun is, a knowledge of pollsters perhaps, or maybe an error of pollsters, I don't know. But I was worried that we'd all sort of basically say the same thing, and there's a danger that we might cover some of the same ground, but I'll try not to repeat all the excellent points that have already been made, and build on those. So just a sort of general observation first, which is about local elections or devolved elections, which I think in some ways aren't a terribly helpful guide actually to the popularity of a party or predictors of future general election success. But that doesn't stop us all having a go at trying to marry those bits up. But just a few flags, some of which have already been made. Obviously turnout varies considerably. Carla's made that point and pointed out the risks for Labour with that. There are very different issues at risk, I think, when you think what's happening locally and what's happening at a national level. Obviously, devolved governments have very different functions and powers, and there are very different stories playing out there. And it can be a very kind of low risk protest. So, you know, you can vote for the monster raving loony party without fear of them being in government and forming a government. So that's also a risk that people perform, if you like, or vote in a different way. And especially for parties of opposition, which is obviously where Labour is and unfortunately has been for some time, local government matters because people have forgotten what Labour is like in national government. And so very often how Labour performs at a local level is the only thing that anybody has to go on. And it really can be, I think, a very sort of useful dipstick, especially when we have a bumper crop as we do this year. So we're obviously too early for that kind of midterm feeling. But, you know, and I think anyway, even if we were closer to midterm, COVID has changed all of that. And I think others have alluded to this too. One of the observations that I would make is that the mood at the moment is incredibly volatile. I don't think I've seen it so volatile in decades of looking at public opinion. And I think possibly, given that Labour's in a tricky moment at the moment, that offers a certain amount of hope for Labour, because although we are seeing the vaccine bounce that we've talked about, it does mean, I think, that things can and may change quite quickly. But for the time being, Labour's kind of under new leadership mode is the upwards trajectory that had initially sort of suggested is faltering a little bit. And obviously that means that people are going to be looking at these elections and drawing conclusions. So thinking about the Red Wall, and the reason for thinking about that is because I've recently spent quite a lot of time there and written a book about it. I think in some ways the mayoral contests offer the biggest watch-outs, actually, and I think that's where a lot of the highlighting will go when we look at results. So there's already been some discussion about Andy Street, who beat Sean Simon very narrowly at the last round. The watch out there is that 2019 was very bad for Labour. Labour lost 24 of the seats that it had lost in 2017 in that region. So it means that, that Liam Byrne has got a very, very big task on his hands. Andy Burnham looks, you know, in very good shape and had a very good pandemic. He must be impregnable, so that's the good news. West Yorkshire, where Labour are fielding Tracy Brabin, who took Joe Cox's seat, is another very important battleground. And now, back in the days of Labour government, Labour held all 22 seats in her region, but the Tories won 9 in 2019. And then another, and for my money, the most important area, actually, in lots of ways, is Teesside, Tees Valley. Now, Ben Houchen won very, very narrowly in 2017. My work in the Red Wall suggests, frankly, that he is now a bit of a rock star. I have never known people locally to be able to name a local politician, name check him, and talk about what he had done quite as much as they talked about Ben Houchen. So I think that that is going to be a very, very tricky area for Labour. I wanted to talk a little bit, I won't talk about local elections, I think, in terms of local council elections, but I did want to just spend a moment or two on Hartlepool, sticking with the Northeast, because I think that's also going to be obviously happening at the same time, and very potentially problematic for Labour. It seems actually that both parties are sort of starting to get their excuses in early on that one, and in some ways neither's feeling very confident. So the Tories are talking about, well, you know, we couldn't even win this in 1983 when Mrs. Thatcher won her biggest landslide, so come on. But Labour, of course, would be able to say, well, we only won it last time because the Brexit Party split the anti-Labour vote. And if you take the Brexit Party out of the equation, then actually Labour should be on course potentially to lose that. By-elections, just as a reminder, excite Westminster a lot, but the impact doesn't usually last very long, especially when you combine it with other elections, as we will see in May. But the problem for Hartlepool is that it will be taken with the trend that it goes with, especially on the Red Wall. So if the Tories can make a clean sweep of Hartlepool, of Tees Valley, and of West Yorkshire all at once, then they can fairly claim, I think, that their Red Wall popularity is not fading, but actually increasing. If Labour were to win, then Labour can say that the new leadership has successfully halted the Tories' march. Mixed pattern, and that perhaps is where we're most likely to end up, will be that the jury's out, and that's probably the only sensible and truthful conclusion that you'll be able to draw from these forthcoming elections. But of course, that isn't what the press will look like the next day. I'll, rather than repeat things that people have already said, and we can pick up other things in questions, I did just want to make one point, which is about London, which everybody has talked about, and London relating to the Red Wall. And Chris talked about how incredibly successfully it looks like Sadiq Khan is doing, you know, on 53%, some 20 odd points ahead of Sean Bailey. I think this is potentially a massive problem for Labour. If Labour ends up doing poorly in Red Wall seats and then smashing it out of the park in Labour, in London, then I think that is a huge problem, because what I heard again and again when I was doing the research for my Red Wall book was people were concerned. They felt that Labour had abandoned them. They felt Labour had abandoned voters like them, and that Labour had been taken over by, and this is a direct quote, snobby London graduates. Now, I think that it tells a terrible story that reinforces that view, if it is the case that Labour does very, very, very well in London and not so well in those other places. So I think for me, that's a big watch out. And I think Labour should be thinking carefully about its narrative, should that happen, and perhaps trying to stop it happening. For me, it's not an accident that the Tories are fielding such a weak candidate in London. So perhaps if I leave it there, Siobhain, and hand back to you, and I can see there's loads of questions coming in. So,
yeah, thank you, Deborah. Really interesting and terrifying at the same time. What I propose to do, if everybody is okay, I'm going to take 3 questions or comments at a time, because we want to make sure that everybody can get in. And that is why, this is from Samuel Rushworth, and it's, why does optimism have to mean a challenge for Labour? We won the war, now win the peace. And in 1997, growing economy, low inflation. And from my old university friend, John Howarth, the cheerful Boris Johnson contrasted with the unremitting misery fest that is the Labour Party. Low turnout elections require a reason to vote. What is the reason to vote Labour? And from Fiona O'Farrell, does corruption cut through with voters? Spending taxpayers' monies on services that don't work provided by their Tory chums, but won't give NHS staff a proper pay rise, spending on Downing Street sofas, but not on social care, etc. Who would like to, which of our panel would like to go to those first?
Siobhain, can I,
Yeah.
because I mentioned optimism quite a lot, and the issue with Boris Johnson having an optimistic, it's perceived as being optimistic.
Yeah.
And why can't Labour be optimistic? So I agree with the premise of that question, actually, and that is what I was alluding to in some of my later remarks. How Labour should be targeting those voters, particularly those lost voters, because in 2019, and this is going to be probably my most controversial comment of the night. Fundamentally, it was a change election, and the government of the day won the change narrative. And we could argue for the rest of time about how they did that, but the truth is that they did that, and Boris Johnson did that as their leader. So change has to be, and Labour should be the party of change. I just feel at the moment, because of they're looking at the red wall voters, and the polling and research, and they're hearing what those voters are saying about them spending too much and not trusting them on the economy. And I think that is producing an over caution to a voter group that isn't over cautious. This is a voter group that voted for Brexit. This is not a risk averse voter group that I think some of the political dominant political narratives think it is. So Labour is in a very, very good position to take on Boris Johnson's optimism with a vision of radical is a generic word, overused word, but they want change in their communities, and they want money spent in their communities. They want services in their communities. And I think that's the message. That's the message. It has to be, and that in my view can beat the Conservatives' optimism. Just out optimistic them, because Labour are the opposition and the party of change, and they need to re-grip that. Just very quickly, I'm taking over all the time. Does corruption cut through with voters? Yes and no. Do most voters think that the government is corrupt? Yes. Will it influence their vote? No.
I'm gonna jump in. I agree with pretty much everything Carl said, but I'm just gonna jump in with sort of two caveats that I think I can add on top of that. Firstly, and it's totally true that Labour doesn't need to be cautious economically and shouldn't be cautious economically. They need to be a lot more bold and passionate and positive and optimistic, particularly in their economic outlook. The problem Labour has, I think, is twofold still. And despite these problems having shrunk in size a lot over the past 11 years, the two problems are, firstly, people don't necessarily believe the economic promises that they make, because they're saying, oh, we're going to spend here, and they don't necessarily say where that money is going to come from. They also need to make sure that they're spelling out where that money is going to come from. And it can't just be more debt and deficit. It can be tax the rich. That isn't actually as toxic for the Labour Party as many inside the Labour Party think it is. But it is worse still if their caution leads to them putting forward promises that people don't believe without being willing to spell out where that money is going to come from. And on the corruption point, I agree that people think the Tories are corrupt. and that doesn't affect their vote. But where I think it can affect their vote that's linked to this is this idea that they waste money. That's the argument that really cuts through. What Carl said earlier about people always bringing up in focus groups that that Gordon Brown sold the gold. The big thing that cut through, and even if you ask people now, what do you consider to be most important about economic competence? It's not tax and spend, it's not relationships with the unions, it's not relationships with business. The thing that people will tell you is most important for economic competence is that a government will spend money efficiently and not waste money. So where you can, I think, make some traction is in doing to the Conservatives now, probably through the contracts they're giving to their mates, and saying, look, the government is wasting your money, in the same way as the Conservatives tried to make that argument about a lot of Labour's extra spending in the sort of 97 to 10 years. I think it'd be the 2 points I'd make on that.
Can I come in, Shoben? Yeah. I agree on optimism, and certainly when in the Red Wall, when I asked people why they had voted, why they'd been persuaded to vote for Boris Johnson, I heard so much about his positivity, his optimism, and it is absolutely crucial that Labour has a sort of optimistic story to tell, and at the moment they don't. In fact, they're not really cutting through on anything. I do actually, I'm afraid to say, disagree with both Carl and Chris on the economy. I think that there are different rules. Whilst I think that people are clearly fed up with austerity and clearly have a greater appetite for spending, and the rules have changed, and I don't want to kind of refight the battles that were fought decades ago. At the same time, it remains the fact that Labour is 20 odd points behind in terms of trusted to run the economy. And I do think that Labour is assumed to be profligate in a way that the Tories are not assumed to be profligate. And the biggest challenge that Labour has right now is winning back trust on the economy. That doesn't mean to say don't be bold, by the way, but it does mean, I think Chris touched on this, it means that you have to very clearly account for where the money is coming from. And that certainly didn't happen in 2019. And, when you analyse what people thought about Labour's efforts in 2019, not doing well on the economy was right up there. Yeah, what's the reason to vote Labour? There needs to be one, and it isn't terribly clear at the moment. So I think Labour isn't putting its own stall out clearly, and it needs to do that and do it quite quickly. On the corruption point, the only thing I'd say there is a general observation, which I think that Labour needs to have a much clearer tax strategy than it currently has. It needs to decide where the vulnerabilities for the Tory party are and then go for them much more consistently. At the moment, I feel Labour's attack is a kind of blunderbuss and therefore isn't really landing. It might be that corruption is the right way to be honest, I don't really know. Somebody somewhere, and it's not me, needs to do some detailed work to find out where the vulnerabilities are, but there needs to be a much more finely honed attack, and I'm not hearing that at the moment, and it's problematic. I think we're missing a lot of opportunities because of that. Siobhain, I think you're on mute.
Gideon, I wonder if you've got anything you'd want to add.
I think it's all been laid out excellently by the other three. So following up from one of Deborah's points, I imagine some critics of pollsters would call a group of pollsters a herd of pollsters. So I won't encourage that thinking anymore.
Okay, thank you very much, Gideon. I'm just going to, my next three, I can see so many old friends asking questions here. It's quite, this is from Joshua Phillips. It's catch-22 for Labour on the economy. Clearly the public are on balance on the left when it comes to economics, but they don't trust Labour. So tax and spend narratives work for the Tories, while for Labour, they just make us look profligate. This is really Deborah's kind of point here. Not sure what the answer is. From Brad Baines, what is the panel's expectation for the council results in England, particularly the county council elections? These have been a historically bad cycle for Labour. 2009 post-crash fall, 2013 peak UKIP, 2017 26 points behind Theresa. And from Paul Wheeler, whilst I understand the interest in the red wall voters, I do wonder what we are doing to broaden our appeal to southern towns such as Swindon, Yeovil and Bath, particularly with the ongoing collapse of the Liberal Democrats. Thoughts from our panel?
Shall I just pop in on the southern towns, because I completely agree, actually, despite the fact that I've just written this book about the Red Wall. Some time ago, years ago, actually, I did a piece of work with the Fabians called Southern Discomfort, where we picked 6 constituencies that Labour would have had to have won in 1992 for Labour to win. And at the time, I mean, I have to say, I think actually from memory, all of them are now Tory. Some of them are now fairly safe Tory seats or regarded as such, Harlow, for example. And I was idly thinking the other day that it would be really interesting to go back and revisit them, because I'm worried. I think the link here actually, and it is about working class voters everywhere, because if you take working class voters in somewhere like Harlow, they're not very different in lots of ways from working class voters in red wall seats. Yeah, I think it's incredibly important not to forget about those seats. I think there are lots of southern seats that Labour could do quite badly in.
Who's next from the panel?
Shall I just come in on those 2 points? I'll come in on the point Deb just made, and then also the first question from Josh as well, which I think also links to the previous comments Deborah was making. So on the sort of southern strategy, if you like, I mean, Carl laid out very clearly, and I think eloquently, and I think I 100% agree that, you know, there are trade-offs between the views of your, and this doesn't map neatly onto north and south. Obviously, there's lots of places in the south that actually feel a lot more red wally. There's lots of places in the north that feel more like London, right? It doesn't map neatly onto geography, but there is a trade-off between views of sort of more metropolitan based liberal voters and more socially conservative voters, which we'll call, for argument's sake, red wall voters. Like there will regularly be at points over the next few years when Labour has to make a decision between those two voter groups, and I think most people would agree that when making those decisions, they should have a slight priority for the views of socially conservative voters over the views of metropolitan voters, for a variety of reasons, not least of which they're based in the kind of places that make them more convenient for a winning electoral coalition. Now that doesn't mean you don't care about the other side. In fact, you may make some decisions that will make that other side happier than this side, but you have a bias in that direction. You think about them more, you spend more effort and strategy and energy trying to win them back. Not least of which, for among other reasons, because of their importance. Having said that, I don't think it's ever going to be the case that Labour is going to completely reverse the trends of recent years. I don't think Labour is ever going to go back to a position where they were doing so badly in a lot of the south and so well in the north. I don't think we're ever going to go back to that divide. Labour will go up, and I think Labour should try and go up more in those kind of areas they've lost than in the kind of areas which they've never held. But I think they'll go up in both, so if they go up at all. So in which case, yes, Labour will hopefully be winning back for the Labour Party, hopefully be winning back a lot of those red wall seats. But I think also the next time Labour wins an election, we will see them starting to win a lot more seats across the south that would have seemed completely nuts a few years ago. Seats like Bournemouth being good examples, a lot of sort of commuter town seats around London. You'd never have imagined the party winning 20 years ago, not least of all because this pandemic is going to lead to lots of people moving out of London and to a lot of commuter towns, and lots of younger people will flood into those cities and make them more Labour and things like that. So I think Labour does need to focus on those red wall voters, but I still think that Labour is going to be starting to win back, if they're successful, a lot more southern cities than they would have done before this sort of red wall collapse that we've seen in recent years. The other point I was going to make was on the sort of the catch-22 and the not voting Labour. I think basically Labour needs to accept that there's economic trade-offs, and therefore if they're going to offer to spend money, they're going to have to say where they're going raise that money from. And that's one of the ways they get back economic credibility. The other way they get back economic credibility is by showing that they're not going to be frivolous with money. Part of that is in, as we mentioned before, showing up all of the ways that the Conservatives are being frivolous with money, but also trying to think of ways that they can make sure that their priorities for spending are aligned with the public, but also thinking of ways of making the argument that they're just not going to waste money, they're going to spend it efficiently and effectively. That's how they get back economic credibility, and that's how they're then listened to the public on these kind of issues again, at least according to the sort of work I've seen.
Yeah, thank you very much, Chris. Unless Carl and Gideon really want to come in, I might move to the next 3 questions and give you the first go on the next set. Would that be okay?
Yes, it's fine.
Okay, great. From Emily Wallace, over the last few years, we have analysed the electorate in relation to Leave and Remain and attitudes to Brexit rather than breakfast, particularly in the Red Wall. To what extent are these still important? From Tessa Holden, how might the removal of supplementary vote, so the return to first past the post in the mayoral elections, change things? Joshua Phillips worries about the impact of Ben Hoochen's rock star status on the Hartlepool by-election. And John Howarth tells us that Hoochen has a clever comms strategy, limited simple promise, delivery points and achievements. He can give a reason to vote for him. He should sadly be a shoo-in. And I'll just include Sam Rushworth, and he's saying, I'm running Bishop Auckland's County Council campaign. We're not finding increasing Tory popularity. Our data is showing people switching back to Labour, but not in sufficient numbers. Gideon or Carl, have you anything you might want to say on some of those points?
Shall I go? I'm just on some of them. I mean, the point about Leave and Remain, yes, but I think one could argue whether it's Leave and Remain that had sort of created these identities, or whether they were ones that were already actually, you know, they're just labels that we put on pre-existing divides. I mean, regardless, it's so you know, nor is it the case that everybody is only described by Leave and Remain. I think probably the best way of thinking about it is fractional, you know, sort of a fractionalized form of politics, and people wearing different hats and on different axes. But it's still an important lens. I think it feeds into, for example, much of what Chris was saying. There are some signs it's not becoming quite as important. I think certainly if you look at some of the focus groups, say that James Johnson has been talking about, he says he feels that there's much less concern about Brexit. There's a general feeling that Brexit has got done. I'm not sure if it's completely fallen off the agenda, and certainly in many ways Leave and Remain identities are as important, if not more important, than traditional party identities. But I think the bit for Labour is to think about not so much Leave and Remain per se in terms of how they relate to Brexit, but how they relate to some of the kind of the cultural and different divides that everyone else has been talking about so far. I'm not going to talk about first past the post or Hartlepool. Briefly on the common strategy, that's exactly what, when I first started working at Ipsos MORI a million years ago and did lots of local government research, that's exactly what we used to say for local government. Pick a few key messages, bang on about it, say that you've taken into account, you've listened to what people have told you, you've picked up those key messages, and now you're delivering them. So that's absolutely what I would have been saying you know, for years. It's just classic comm strategy. And I'm not going to pretend any particular knowledge of what's going on the ground in Bishop Auckland, but you know, just to go back to what I said right at the very beginning, you know, it's not the case that Labour are getting terrible numbers. You know, there has been a very slight swing towards Labour, even if it's not quite as good as maybe where it was a few months ago. Keir Starmer's ratings have fallen, but they're still, as I said, pretty average. You know, it's not that Labour is in a kind of an unredeemable position, but yes, I agree. Probably the key bit is whether it's doing well enough, and thinking of the big question, probably thinking about the next couple of years is, from where it is now, can it build up again, or is it going to keep on drifting down? Is it going to be able to kind of talk to people about a post-COVID recovery, and people will start to pay more attention to Labour at that point? At which place it's, is it about treading water now and sort of striking whilst the iron is hot post-COVID in the recovery period, or has it already missed its chance? And I think that's the bit that we still don't know.
Carl, anything you'd like to add?
Yeah, just a little bit on the Leave Remain issue. So is it still important, as a specific political entity? I think it is diminishing, frankly, because Brexit has been done. But we've discussed this. Deborah mentioned the London issue, the London and Redwall issue. And I mentioned does Labour double down on its younger city, more graduate base, or does it double all its efforts to win back older voters that have switched to the Conservatives? And I think that strikes at the heart of the Leave Remain thing. So the issue of Leave and Remain has gone, but the scars and the political attitudes of who the parties represent are very, very deeply there. So, I mean, my personal view is quite well known on this, that attempts to have another referendum in the last Parliament were less than helpful for Labour's need to win back those voters, particularly in the Midlands and the North. Now, I think that will resonate for some time, not the issue itself, but the approach that Labour took to Brexit and that referendum. So I think that is key. Supplementary vote in mayoral elections, I'll be honest, I don't really know anything about that, so I'll leave that to someone who does. Hartlepool, it's anyone's guess. I think it to an extent depends on which of the smaller parties hits the ground running. So if it's the and I don't know much about any of these parties, but if it's the Northern Independence Party, I think that's likely, by what it looks, to draw votes from Labour. If it's one of the four predecessors of the Brexit Party and UKIP, I think that will benefit Labour. So the first will hurt Labour, the second will benefit Labour.
Thank you very much.
I've got that the wrong way around, but it doesn't matter.
Thank you very much, Carl. And now our next questions from Debbie Jackson. What about Liverpool, if it's true that Labour won't object to the Tories taking control? David Lipsey says it won't be good for Labour if we go on building huge majorities in London and big cities and tiny minorities elsewhere. The electoral system may not help. Easy to imagine Labour winning most votes, but Tories most seats. And John Howarth, again, well, of course, we want and need snobby London graduates, but the issue is how that is resolved with constructing a new Labour coalition. So question, what is the key to building a new alliance of interests for Labour? Discuss. Who would like to have a first go?
That on the coalition point.
Yeah.
So I have a chapter on this in my book because we did a citizens' jury for Labour Together, where after the last election, where we looked at, we brought together Redwall ex-Labour voters and young Remainy kind of graduate urban Labour supporters, and spent a day and a half with them, sort of trying to understand what the differences were and then what the common ground was. And in the end, we found some common ground. I mean, it is there. And I think, by the way, that's the divide. I mean, we've talked about Leave Remain. I agree with everything that's been said about, in a way, that particular battle has happened. But the values that underpin those different votes correspond very closely with the problem that Labour faces in terms of, social class, age, values divide. And that played out very clearly with this citizens' jury. So where is the common ground, and how do you make it work? I think, very simply, it means, I think, that the urban Remainers have to be prepared to concede a bit of ground. I think that's clear, and I think they felt it was clear as well. And ultimately, why will they do that? Well, actually, because they want to win, and they understand that they won't win unless they do concede some ground. But actually, it was perhaps easier than you might think to find a way of exciting both groups around a very positive message that talked to the things that they really cared about, like ending poverty, like improving the NHS, and you could envisage putting together a sort of positive agenda that would tick a lot of boxes. And we explored that in the citizens' jury, and it's, as I say, I've written a chapter about it in the book, because it was quite an important point to make, I think, in the context of the Red Wall problem. So perhaps I'll leave it there and let others come in.
Anybody else on Liverpool or London or the Grand Coalition?
Can I just to reply on the previous question about supplementary votes? I don't think any of us touched on that, if that's all right. No. I mean, the supplementary vote is basically the worst and most crazy voting system that's ever been elected. It makes very little sense. And one of the reasons it is so crazy and makes so little sense is because it's very, very difficult for normal voters to work out how you should vote under that system. Now, what that ends up meaning is that most votes do not effectively funnel through from the first round to the second round anyway. So, a lot of them get wasted, a lot of them don't make a difference, and those that do usually end up falling out pretty much exactly the same as the votes in the first round. So that's a fairly complicated way of seeing what difference do I think there is in moving from the supplementary vote to first past the post. Actually, very, very little difference. It might benefit the Conservatives very slightly, but I don't think it will be enough to be noticeable in most cases.
Okay, thank you very much for adding that, Chris. Unless there is anybody from the panel desperate to come back to some of those questions, because we've got loads, I will move on. And again, from Fiona O'Farrell, that's really interesting about the message of government wasting money. I felt very resentful paying my tax in January. I felt I might as well have written a cheque for Matt Hancock's neighbour. And Rory Taylor, can Labour ever win elections again if it doesn't learn to love Tony Blair? Some of us haven't stopped. Does the panel think that there is any evidence that the negativity towards Keir Starmer from some inside and outside of the party is affecting our chances, or does it just seem worse from inside the bubble? That was from Darren Price. And from Rosemary Nichols, I'm upset by the lapse in integrity from the 1990s days of the Nolan standards. Does this worry only me? Over to our panel.
Could I do the Tony Blair question, Siobhain?
You can.
Since I worked for him and Jeremy Corbyn. So can Labour ever win elections if it doesn't learn to love Tony Blair? So I think the answer to that is yes. All right. And this isn't any commentary on the benefits, the merits or not of Tony Blair. I think Labour needs to move beyond whether people love Tony Blair or whether they love Jeremy Corbyn, because I think both of those issues are not helpful for Labour's future. I think there are lessons that Labour can learn from both of those people, actually. And Tony Blair captured the message of change, and he in the 1990s, and he created a narrative about what was wrong with the country. Okay, actually, in the same way that, in a different way, Jeremy did for a period of time. So in some respects, they were both successful political leaders in opposition. But there are big differences now and the 1990s, which I think also needs to be acknowledged. In the 1990s, the vast majority of people's wages were higher in proportion to their earning, in proportion to their housing costs and their cost of living. In the preceding 10 to 15 years, demographics have changed and people's economic circumstances have changed, which has left a massive generational change, which affects the way you do politics. Tony Blair could win a coalition through what was then a centrist third way, if you like, but that doesn't quite work now, because people that benefit from one thing, others will lose from the other. So there's less of a natural coalition. So I think that has changed, and that's changed the nature of the economic debate. So I think there are lessons that people can learn from Tony Blair, but I don't think it's the case that Labour can only win elections if it learns to love him. That's my answer.
Do you, anybody else on the panel like to?
Can I make a slightly different point on the Tony Blair thing, which is that I do think I think it's quite hard for Labour to win a future election if Labour doesn't give the past Labour government some credit and embrace it in a positive way. You know, you wouldn't, as a car salesman, say, buy this new car. The last one I made was rubbish, but, you know, this one's much better. And I think there are lots of really positive stories to tell about that Labour government period that aren't being told and don't get told. On the economy, for example, I think it's true that under Labour governments, historically, typically you are much more likely to get growth than you are under Tory governments, if you look across the piece. On the vaccination story, for example, why have we got this vaccination, the AstraZeneca Oxford, is because actually that government invested hugely in science and academia and encouraged the sort of coalition between them and, you know, the kind of commercial coalition that we've seen with AstraZeneca. There are positive stories to tell and they're not being told. And I think if Labour looks like it's ashamed of its time in government, why would anybody trust it to be in government again, I think.
Thank you very much, Deborah. If I move on now, unless anybody on the panel's got something burning they'd like to say.
I'll just say Darren's question gets answered. I'll just say that it definitely does feel a lot worse, I think, for people inside the Labour Party, the sort of battles, than it does outside. I can't, you know, it's not good to have a divided party. It's not good to be having these internal arguments. It means, among other things, you're going to have less people going out and making the case for the Labour Party. But that's not going to be the thing. You know, these battles between factions and people within the party criticising Keir Starmer, that's not going to be the thing that loses Labour the next election. And they need to focus on the things that the country cares about, not necessarily just the things that people on Twitter or even the Labour Party membership care about.
Sorry, if I could just jump in there and make a point as well on that. And I completely agree with what Chris has just said. I mean, in focus groups I've been doing, I don't pick up a huge negativity towards Keir Starmer. Actually, the problem he's got is slightly different, which is that people don't know very much about him, other than that he isn't the guy that went before. That needs to be addressed, clearly. But I think the negativity is very much a Westminster bubble point.
Thanks, Deborah. And if we move to Joe Jervis, are we a party of victimhood? Every election seems to be a difficult one for Labour. The Tories have had to handle Brexit fallout and a pandemic. Fiona O'Farrell asks, Scotland, is it lost forever? And if we can't rebuild there, how can we ever get into government again? Paul Wheeler, he's making the point about policies and who they're for. He says one good example is the continuing obsession of many Labour councils with low traffic neighbourhoods, which ignore the reliance of huge numbers of working class voters on vehicles to earn a living. There is a balance here, but we continually fail to see it. I'm with you, Paul. Anybody on the panel got a point to make? Carl, are you anybody from our panel?
I live very near Paul. Yeah, I'm here.
Good.
Shall I answer that, Siobhain?
Yes, please. Yeah.
I was just noting that I live very near Paul and are very aware of the arguments and merits and downsides of low traffic neighbourhood things. And I think I know exactly the issue and case which Paul refers to. I don't have strong views on it myself. I tend to veer towards thinking it's an overall good thing if it's managed well. On is Scotland lost forever? No, I don't think it is. But I think that got a very big structural problem, which isn't really to do with who runs it at any point or whether it's the left or the right or whatever, but it's because the SNP have replaced Labour as the centre-left party in Scotland, and anywhere where that's happened in the world, you only ever get one sort of mainstream centre-left party in any democracy. And the SNP very skillfully, via combining the issue of independence with a vision of a sort of progressive New Scotland, managed to take a sizable proportion of both Labour's existing votes and the newer, younger voters that have been flocking to Labour in England in the last 10 years have gone to the SNP because they support Scottish independence and they see that as the progressive force for the future. So it is a structural problem that I don't think will be resolved until the independence issue is settled. I think it's incredibly complicated because I think probably what Labour needs to do to win back those votes in Scotland is probably undoable. So I think Labour is in a Brexit style bind in Scotland where its voter base is very split in ways which are very unhelpful in terms of building an electoral coalition. I think that's it.
Thank you.
There was a question, why are Labour always victims? I'll let someone else do that.
Anybody from our panel?
I was just going to pick up on the Scotland point and say I generally agree with the points Carl made. The 2 points to bear in mind is that the SNP can't defy the laws of political gravity forever. You can't be in government forever, and eventually they're going to have to make a mistake that is toxic to their brand and means that voters go off them. It's the rule of large numbers. Eventually, that's going to happen. Labour just needs to be in the right place to capture the votes when they do. Maybe it will end up being this salmon scandal. I'm cynical. Maybe it will be botching another Scottish independence referendum and that issue sort of being considered put to bed and the Scottish people moving on. Labour just needs to start rebuilding its brand, which actually it has started to do. Labour is nowhere near as toxic in Scotland as it was back in 2014, 2015. So starting to try and piece back together its brand and make sure it's there to kind of catch it when and if the SNP eventually drop it, and just basically hang around until that happens. And I think eventually it's going to have to.
Can I just add a point? I agree with everything that's been said about Scotland, and I also, on a positive note, think that Anna Sarwar has made a fantastic start He's very talented, I think, very strategic, very thoughtful, and arguably the person that's looked most like a leader that Labour have had for really quite a long time. His speech the other day was really, really good, and I feel he's striking all the right notes. So I think that's more cause for optimism.
And just on a strategic point as well, standing against Sturgeon, is what the difficulty Labour Party will have in this election is being shut out of the debate because they're now in third place and they're the third party. So trying to turn it back into a battle of SNP versus Labour by physically standing himself against Sturgeon in her constituency, even if he stands no chance to winning, I thought was like a really, really smart thing to do.
I might just pick up on, Chris's point about political gravity, and maybe this relates to the question around victimhood, which I think I understand as Labour being the victim, and feeling sorry for itself. And it's totally true. That was one of the most interesting things is how political gravity has not applied to the Conservatives. The Conservatives have raised their vote share pretty consistently every single election. I remember writing a report 20 years ago or whatever about the sort of the traditional political cycle, and how the Conservatives have been amazing, that the Conservatives have managed to, as Carl kind of talked about before, kind of each time create themselves as the party for change, and Labour has just failed, and Labour has, I think, probably failed because it hasn't met some basic, if you were trying to do some sort of Maslow hierarchy of needs thing for politics, Labour has just failed to meet some basic tests that the public would set, and so hasn't been able to fight the Conservatives on those grounds. What I agree with what most people I think are saying is that what Keir Starmer has done is he's taken away a lot of that negativity. So the sort of he's at least gone up a few steps. We're not now kind of searching for food and shelter anymore. But there is still a step up again. So, but we're now, we're reaching towards a self-actualization stage, and that's where there's still lots that hasn't been done.
Thank you. I'd like to just go. I'm going to make a group of our last questions, and from Dan McCurry, the scars of Brexit remain, although the approach of Labour was to tell the truth, not lie. And Fiona Farrell says, why should Labour repeat the narrative that Brexit is done when it really isn't? Huge impacts on exports, which lead to the failure of many small businesses. And I don't know if this is my own Terry Daniels, who's the treasurer of Mitcham and Morden Labour Party, but the received wisdom is that a divided party does not win elections. Do the panel think that voters will see Labour as a divided party? And to Darren Price, absolutely read the Blair and Corbyn progress momentum dialogue. It's not helpful, and we must, as a party, move on. We must focus on a new vision, not old arguments and personalities. And I hope you don't mind, Paul, if I don't explain your position further on local traffic reduction. But those are our questions.
If I just go very quickly on a couple of them, maybe.
Thank you.
On Brexit, I think it's interesting that people, I don't think people do think it's done in the sort of, people still think that negotiations are going to continue. It's not that people think that everything is magically perfect on Brexit, but I think it's a question that's going to move from being a political kind of divisive question to one that's more, operational and competence. And certainly at the moment that's playing into the Conservatives' hands because people think that the UK is doing a much better job on vaccines, is the big obvious one that is going to be driving views on that. So it is going to be difficult for Labour on Brexit in the short term, because I don't think it's necessarily it's not a political Remain Leave question in quite the same way anymore. And just briefly on divided parties, yes, it always slightly feels, you've got to get your causation the right way round. on this. You know, is it losing because is Labour losing because it's divided, or is Labour losing because it hasn't actually quite sorted out what it's about and what it's trying to do, and that causes the divisions, and then obviously people see that as well, but you've got to get it in the right order, and I'll leave it at that.
Can I just jump in quickly on those 2 points as well? Firstly, on like the divided party point, if you know, if it was really, really important in politics not to have divided parties, then what you wouldn't do, say if you came in as a new prime minister, is literally boot out half your shadow cabinet, spend a few months ripping apart your party, kick a load of MPs out of your party who then go on to independent, because then you definitely wouldn't go on to win an election 2 months later, except that's exactly what happened in 2019. I'm not saying that being divided helps. I'm just trying to make the point that the Conservatives ripped themselves apart for months before pushing themselves back together in a way that made them an election-winning machine. So it's not necessarily, that's evidence enough that being divisive, if it's got a greater goal, is politically toxic. On the Brexit thing, from a sort of strategy point of view, Brexit's going to be a disaster, or Brexit is not going to be a disaster, and that's completely outside the hands of the Labour Party. The question is, if Brexit goes on to be a disaster, the question is, in both of those situations, is Labour Party going to be in a better position if it's spent years going, oh, Brexit, that's a bad idea? And the honest answer is no, it's not. If Brexit's a disaster, people are going to blame the government, regardless of whether Labour was saying it for years. And if Brexit's not a disaster, Labour's going to look really stupid for drudging up an old battle that was a really difficult issue for them, that put a division down the middle of their electoral coalition. So I think Labour is making the right decision by, at least pretending that the issue's moved on and has put behind them. And if it comes back later, let the government deal with the consequences of that without Labour having to take the hit.
Just a couple of points, Siobhain. Can I? Yeah. Can I just come? So I agree with Chris about divided parties. I don't think it is the issue that it was 20, 30 years ago. I think to an extent, the voters take it as a given that Labour is divided. I think the issue is not that it's divided, but the optics around that. So, if there's constantly bad negativity coming out, then that's bad. But the fact that it's divided in itself is, I don't think, intrinsically bad. And, you could be creative about the divisions within a party and sort of take the best bits here and there of what different people are saying, and that could be good. On Brexit, agree with what Chris said. I think that, and this won't be universally popular, the Conservatives in the sort of late 90s, 2000s used to talk about Brexit an awful lot. And I am concerned that Labour is starting to become a party that bangs on about Brexit. And I really wish that it wouldn't. That's it.
Thank you, Carl. Deborah, I think that's over to you. I think you can have the last word.
Brilliant. Okay, thanks. So, I think I agree with most of what's been said. For my money, the problem with being divided is simply that you end up talking about yourselves and to yourselves rather than talking to voters about the things they care about. And I think that's the problem. And where Labour's got to at the moment is that it's not that it's in a bad place, it's just that it isn't saying anything that's striking a chord with voters. And in recent focus groups I've done, as I said earlier, it's not that there's a negative vibe, it's that when you say what are Labour about, they're a bit invisible, they're a bit absent, they're a bit quiet. Labour now, quite urgently, I think, needs to set out its own stall. I don't mean like a full manifesto, obviously, of course I don't mean that, but Labour needs to start telling a story about what the kind of post-COVID Britain Labour wants to see actually looks like, with a few concrete and tangible examples. And I think it needs to do that quite quickly. And I think if it can do that, then it's a way of uniting the party around that vision too. But there's no time to lose now.
Thank you. I'd like to thank, I'm sure everybody who's been on this call tonight would like to thank Deborah, Chris, Carl and Gideon. I hope that everybody's enjoyed it, and as far as we possibly could, we've got through everybody's questions and comments. I'd like to thank SME for Labour and the indefatigable Ibrahim Dogas for organising this event. I wish everybody an enjoyable rest of their evening, and I hope that I'll get to meet you all very soon. Thank you very much.